Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our distinguished guest today is Kishore Mahbubani, who is Dean and Professor of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. His new book is The Asian Hemisphere. Kishore, welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back here.
One of the themes in your book is the transformation of Asia. Give us a sense of that. I mean, how have things changed in just over the period of your distinguished career and into the present?
Well, I mean, we are clearly entering a new era of world history. And I describe it in two ways. One is, of course, I describe it as the end of the era of Western domination of world history, but not the end of the West, which will remain the single strongest civilization for some time to come. And secondly, you're seeing finally a return of Asia. But the return of Asia, is important to remember, is a return to the norm. Because while the West has been very powerful in the last 200 years, if you look back over the last 2,000 years, from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies in the world were consistently China and India. So only in the last 200 years, the West has taken off. Now finally, the Asian societies have figured out what they need to do to succeed. And as I say in my book, they're implementing the 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And you will see clearly by 2050, as the Goldman Sachs study shows, the 4 largest economies in the world will be number 1, China, number 2, United States of America, number 3, India, number 4, Japan. And not a single European economy will be among the top 4. And that's a huge shift of world history.
Talk a little about the what you call the pillars that made these changes possible. And some of this, if not a lot of it, was learning from the West. So the West has played an important mentor role facilitating this change.
Oh yes, I think the word mentorship is a good word to use. And in fact, one of the more optimistic messages I give in the book is that the Asians, as they emerge, do not want to dominate the West as the West dominated Asia. They actually want to replicate the West and implement its best practices. And you know, it's remarkable how by implementing some fairly simple, straightforward Western policies, how the societies transform themselves. Take China, for example, right? Before they implemented free market economics, when I went to China in 1980 and I went to the barber to have a haircut, he gave me a wonderful haircut, but he took 1 hour. So I said, why do you take 1 hour to do a haircut? He says, well, it doesn't matter whether I do 5 haircuts, 10 haircuts, I get paid the same. So what's the hurry? So, but once you implemented free market economics and you created incentives for people to work, the same people who had been unproductive, for 100 years plus, suddenly became very productive and very dynamic. And for China, the world's most populous country, to have the fastest growing economy in the world for 30 years is as unusual as watching the fattest boy in class win the 100-meter race. And that's because of free market economics.
You throughout the book, you have some really interesting statistics, and in one case, you quote from the president of China, I guess a press conference that he had in which he went over the figures, and I think they're worth repeating, that in the period 78 to 2004, China has gone from 147.3 billion to 1.6 trillion in its GDP. In foreign trade, during that same period, it's gone from 20.6 billion to 1.15 trillion, and that is a growth rate of 16%. The GDP, which I just gave you, has grown 9.4%. And the foreign exchange reserves increased from 167 million to 609.9 billion in 2004 and still growing. So just an extraordinary achievement. And the bottom line here is that Asia is by following free market economics, is creating a middle class.
Oh, enormously. And I'm very glad that you read out those statistics. And by the way, the latest figures are even more impressive. That their GNP is over $2 trillion. Their foreign reserves are $1.3 trillion. I mean, it's amazing. Yes, the huge middle class is being created in both China and India. And this naturally shifts the center of gravity of the world to Asia, because I mean, it is already China with over 300 million people in the middle class has a bigger middle class than the United States of America. And most Americans are not even aware of that. And when you create a middle class, the most important thing that happens is that you create a class of what Bob Zoellick once asked China to do, to become a responsible stakeholder. Well, middle-class citizens are almost by definition responsible stakeholders. And so as a consequence, one of the piece of good news that results from the success of Asia is that we are moving to a safer world rather than a more dangerous world. And this is an important point to emphasize to a Western audience, because whenever Western leaders speak, they always begin their speeches by saying we are moving into a more dangerous world, a world that is full of threats. That's not true. Actually, with the rise of the huge numbers of people entering the middle classes in China and India and other societies, we are actually seeing a more peaceful and stable world that is emerging. And this is why the West should welcome the rise of Asia and not try to resist the rise of Asia.
On the middle class, there's another figure I want to quote here. In 2000, 56 million belong to the middle class in China. By 2030, there will be 361 million more than the entire population of the U.S. So, let's just go through some of the things the changes that were sort of in a way. Ways of doing things that were bestowed by the West. You talk about science and technology, a big change there in the way Asia thinks about science and technology.
Oh, yes. In fact, when I was doing some research for the book, I came across a Time magazine cover story on Asia and science. And they quoted a late Nobel Prize winner, Richard Smalley, as saying that even as close as 2010, 90% of all the PhDs in science and technology will be held by Asians. Now, even if it's not 90%, even if it's 85% or 80%, it's quite a remarkable shift, of world history. And the reason why the West was able to go out and conquer and dominate the world is because it mastered science and technology in a spectacular fashion. Today, Asians are discovering that they can do the same also. And indeed, I quote a column from Tom Friedman. He attends a graduation ceremony of a leading university here in America. And when they read out the list of PhD graduates, they're all Asian names, Wang, Lee, Tan, or Kapoor, Kumars. And he said, finally, one David Morrow saved the day, and there was one, there was funny. One, I guess, what you might call a white American male. So this is a remarkable shift, And what this means is that the transformation of Asia is real. This is not a ephemeral thing. This is actually a fundamental shift of world history, and the mastery of science and technology in some ways confirms it.
Two other figures I want to cite from your book. Asia's share of global high-tech exports rose from 7% in 1980 to 25% in 2001, while the U.S. share went from 31% to 18%. And then from 1983 to 2003, students from four Asian countries, China, Taiwan, India, and South Korea, own more than 50% of the science and engineering doctoral degrees awarded in the United States. So Tom Friedman wasn't seeing a mirage. You have a wonderful way of expressing this change. You talk about the march to modernity and how this affected the poor on the one hand, but then the other thing, you have a beautiful turn of phrase here. introducing gifted people to the global society, namely the untapped mental resources that are in Asia and were never tapped because of the poverty.
Yeah, well, I must say I'm amazed how well you've read the book.
Yeah.
Well, and you have highlighted two very critical points in the book. One, the phrase "march to modernity," and I hope that that phrase "march to modernity" becomes used more and more often in the contemporary discourse, because it is this march to modernity that is making the world a safer place. It began, as you know, with Japan, the first Asian country to succeed. From Japan, it went to the Four Tigers. From the Four Tigers, it went to Southeast Asia. And then when, as I say in the book, when the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping looks all around the borders of China and says, hey, why is every economy around China doing better than China? And why not China? So he switches the systems. So the march to modernity enters China. And then when China takes off, India says, come on, we are as good as China. We can do it too. So now India is also taking off. And this brings me to the really important piece of good news, okay? This march to modernity is now about to enter the Islamic world. Now, can you imagine an Islamic world where you have the elites and the middle class saying, our vision is to be like China and India. We want to have successful, growing, modernizing economies. That's where we want to go. And if the Islamic population begins to create very large middle class, it means a much safer world for all of us, because they too become responsible stakeholders, you know. And the second point you mentioned is, I think, an equally important one. When people ask me, you know, if I had to give a very simple explanation of why Asia is taking off now, I say the simplest way to understand it is this. Asia had hundreds of millions of brains, always, but they were never used, you know. They were, you know, in Asia, because of traditional Asian culture, birth was destiny. If you were born in the untouchable caste in India, you could never leave the untouchable caste. So can you imagine millions of brains being wasted? But in India today, you can have someone who grew up in an untouchable family, suffered a terrible childhood, being excluded, being kept aside from his classmates in class, and then that same person could go on, do well in school, get a PhD at Columbia University, and become the chief economist of the Reserve Bank of India. His name is Narendra Yadav. And the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, says that this is an enormous silent revolution taking place in India. And all the brains like Narendra Yadav's that were wasted for centuries are now emerging and creating a tremendous explosion of gifted people all over Asia.
It's interesting because toward the end of the Cold War, and as Asia began to rise, the idea was, okay, Asia, there were so many different peoples, so many ethnic divisions, so many different countries, that we were entering an era in which war would be constant or intermittent at a minimum in Asia. That didn't happen. Why not?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've noticed, as you know, in what happens in academia is that as a result of textbooks, you get recycled wisdom being sent to the students, you know. And unfortunately, most students in America and Europe keep reading the old stuff that was written about Asia, which says, and I quote this in my first book, Can Asians Think?, that Europe's past is Asia's future, which means that the Europe that used to fight each other for centuries will therefore, this is what Asian powers will do. As they rise and emerge, they will fight each other like the European powers do. And this assumes, of course, that the Asians cannot think, cannot figure out for themselves, hey, what works in the world. Indeed, but as I explain in the book, one of the 7 pillars of Western wisdom that the Asians are learning is what is called the culture of peace. And here the biggest tribute I give to the European Union is that the European Union has reached the highest level of human civilization. And by the highest level, I mean that in Europe you don't just have 0 wars between any 2 EU member states, you also have zero prospect of war. And that's an incredible human achievement, you know. And the Asians have studied that and looked at Europe and said, hey, why can't we do it too? Why not learn from Europe? So in Asia, we have already achieved zero wars. Indeed, for the first time in a long time, the guns are silent. There are no more interstate wars anywhere in East Asia. And so you can now proceed to the next level of trying to achieve zero prospect of war. And from all I see in Asia, this is the trend. This is clearly the dominant trend in Asia.
And is it because of the rise of the middle class as part of this march to modernity that there isn't a constituency for war? And on what circumstances might there be?
I think, well, I give a very simple explanation, you know. I say that what you see in Asia today is that Asia has been overcome by a tidal wave of common sense. And, you know, you have more and more young Asians, you know, who can see what life is like. You mentioned YouTube, you mentioned Google, all that's prevalent in Asia. In fact, the degree of broadband penetration is higher in many Asian countries than in America or Europe. This is something very few Americans know. And so they're connected to the modern world. And if you're connected to the modern world, you really realize the futility of war. And in some ways, you know, the Iraq war, which as you know is very tragic, its biggest contribution may have been to further delegitimize war in the modern world. Because the whole world could see that the richest and the most powerful country in the world couldn't invade and occupy a country of 20 million people, very poor country. It shows how difficult war is today. And so it's clear that, of course, the Asian countries will continue to have defense budgets, will continue to have military expenditures, and that, as you know, is prudent, but they're going to try and avoid war.
You look at China as kind of a model in the way it's formulated a foreign policy that has furthered developments in Asia and furthered the stability of the region. Talk a little about that, and why do you think China was able to seize that course?
Well, you know, I've tried to create a new index of what I call geopolitical competence, and in which I put the EU at a 2. You know, it's the former Soviet Union at a 2. It's from 1 to 10. The former Soviet Union at a 2 because it disappeared. The EU at a The most critical decisions that was made in 1945 was not to put the emperor on trial, but to say, hey, if we want to preserve stability in Japan, and we have to preserve social and political stability in Japan, you have to preserve some critical institutions. So you have to understand Japanese history and culture. Now, the people who went to Iraq were the most incredibly arrogant people. And they thought they didn't have to study Iraqi culture at all. And they made disastrous decisions, this de-Baathification. So you remove the entire middle class, the entire ruling elite, and threw them out. And of course, the society falls apart. The glue that holds a society completely fell apart. I make an even more telling comparison between the way the Japanese occupied Singapore in 1942. And even though they were brutal, they made sure that even the British colonial officers who were running Singapore were allowed to stay in their place. I gave the incredible example of the Botanic Gardens in Singapore, which is a world treasure, frankly. And when the Japanese sent a botanist from Tokyo to Singapore, they told the British botanist, please stay. You have to preserve these beautiful gardens. By contrast, the Americans allowed the looting of these incredibly ancient treasures in the Museum of Baghdad. Now that's incredible incompetence, And can finally go out and not face the stress of survival. You have choices to make. You can choose where to work. You can choose to buy television sets. You can choose to travel. And that's a remarkable improvement in your lifestyle. They're experiencing real personal freedom. And the real test of whether or not a society is free or unfree is when its people are allowed to go overseas. Do they come back or do they stay overseas? Right? Obviously, if China was a closed, dark, oppressive society, as soon as the Chinese could leave, they would leave and not come back. But guess what? Each year, over 20 million
people have ideas in their head and they refuse to change. I'm talking about the West now. Is it that the Western intellectuals are not defining this new world and those new ideas are not entering the policy debate? Or is it that Western politicians are worried about the next election?
Well, I think it's a combination of all those factors. And in a sense, this is why I felt a tremendous pressure to write the book at this stage. Because we are now entering one of the most plastic moments of world history. We're going to see shifts of power of a scale that has never before been seen in human history. Incredible shifts of power. Now, with so much shifts of power, you have to begin to adjust and accommodate. And this is where the West, which has got used to 2 centuries of domination of world history, has got to make adjustments. And so, in the West, which always sees itself as being the solution to a problem, cannot conceive of the possibility that the West may now be part of the problem and not just part of the solution. And this idea, by the way, is very difficult to implant in Western minds, because even the most sophisticated intellectuals in the West cannot accept this. Let me give you a simple, concrete example. Soon after my book came out, The Economist gave it a review. And I was very pleased that The Economist gave it a whole-page review. But what did they say the book is? They said the book is an anti-Western polemic. Now, that's a complete misunderstanding of what the book is all about. Indeed, I keep emphasizing that the new Asians don't want to dominate the West, they want to replicate the West. They want to become equal partners of the West. But it is the West that refuses to accept this equal partnership. It is the West that refuses to give up its privileged positions, whether it's in the IMF or World Bank or UN Security Council and so on and so forth. And so the West is today the biggest threat to the world. Now, for me to even say a simple sentence like the West is the biggest threat to the world today is inconceivable to Western minds. It's absolutely inconceivable. And this is why when I explain in my introduction to this book that this book is a painful book. I don't deny that. In fact, my wife, as you know, advised me not to publish it. She said, you're going to get many of your friends unhappy in the West. I say that's true. But the discomfort you feel on reading my book is the necessary discomfort you have to go through to begin to understand the nature of the new world that is emerging.
If you look at the presidential debates in the United States, and you look at the issues that you raise, almost none of them are being discussed. I mean, so it's somewhat frightening, that we seem to be incapable of learning from a book like yours, on the one hand, that is the elites. But the second is one doesn't see a way out except for the collapse that you're trying to warn against.
Yeah. The American presidential debates are distressing because they focus on very short-term issues and they make no effort to look at the world outside. But I think the world has also got used to the fact that most American presidential candidates say one thing during the election campaign and do something completely opposite. I mean, take Bill Clinton, for example. During the election campaign, he said, unlike President George H.W. Bush, I will not coddle the dictators of Beijing. Right? That was in 1992. I saw him in November 1993 do an incredible job of reaching out to the Chinese leader, Jiang Zemin, at the Blake Island meeting in Seattle. And I was present there and I watched the two of them. And he obviously coddled the dictator from Beijing and did a very good job of it after he got elected. In the same way, I think that, for example, if Barack Obama is elected, just the sheer fact that a man like Barack Obama is elected would be a tremendous boost, because he would get rid of half of the anti-Americanism around the world. For the rest of the world to see a member of a minority like Barack Obama win the highest office in the land will send a wonderful, powerful message to the rest of the world. And they will say, what a great and wonderful country America is again. So, it's not just about what they say, it's also about the symbolism of who they elect in these elections.
You're making the distinction in the book between Western values, which the East has followed through on, versus the changing Western interests, and the extent to which that because of elections, because of threat to economic interests, say farmers in Europe, that what we're seeing here is the West moving from a balancing an intersection, an interface of global interests and national interests. We were able to create the post-World War II order. But now there is a divergence of these interests. That is what one would see as a global interest versus a national interest. And you actually really fault the Europeans on this. Talk a little about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, if you want to solve the problems of the world, they can be solved very easily. Just implement Western values. Now, let me give one simple one. The West always speaks of democracy as being the peak of human civilization. What does democracy mean? It means that each citizen has an equal stake in the society. You treat everybody equally. Now, what's happening in the world today is that in the 6.6 billion people in the world, right? In the past, it was only the West that was dynamic, energetic, effective. But that today is only 12% of the world's population. The remaining 88% of the world's population is no longer passive. It is now energetic, effective, and dynamic. And as they become more energized, the first question they ask themselves is, why is it that 12% of the world's population who live in the West control our destinies? This goes against the fundamental principle of democracy. And indeed, if you want to see it is ironic that the West is trying to perpetuate dictatorship in global institutions because it believes in the principles of transparency, accountability, representativeness, and so on and so forth. But the last dictators in the world are the permanent members of the UN Security Council, because you cannot vote them out. They have a veto against being voted out. Now, so this is where the West is not being true to its own values in trying to cope with the New World Order. And one of the most surprising suggestions I make, for example, in the book, is that if you want to ensure a more peaceful and stable world, you want to make sure that the voices of the 88% of the world's population who live outside the West is heard by the world. And there is, fortunately, something which Paul Kennedy calls the Parliament of Man, the UN General Assembly, which can provide the opportunity for us to listen to what the voices in the world are saying. Go listen to them. So, for example, if you believe that something is a great global challenge, don't take it to the UN Security Council, which is so unrepresentative today. Take it to the General Assembly and have a debate down there. And if you get the support of the vast majority of the world's population, then you know you're doing something right. But if they don't support you, then hey, consider the possibility you're doing something fundamentally wrong. So the West has now got to be true to its own principles and listen to the voices of the majority of the world. And I think what my book tries to do is to point out what the rest of the world is beginning to think. And as I say somewhere, please treat me as an early tremor, because behind me comes a big earthquake if you don't listen to this tremor.
You go through a number of issues, proliferation, global warming, the international economy, and in all of these cases, this mass of people who were sort of excluded and their leaders have insights about particular problems. And the West is sort of shooting itself in the foot by not hearing, because in the present you could have modest change, which actually might enhance our power, although there would be relative decline. And we're oblivious to that. Talk about one of these issues. I mean, even take, for example, the problem of proliferation.
Yeah. Well, the most, as you know, the two most painful chapters I have in the book for a Western reader are the chapters on de-Westernization and the chapter on Western incompetence. And this is something that's quite new, you know. It's quite amazing that on a very wide range of issues, if you look at the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, that's pure incompetence. You look at the Doha round of trade talks and the way it is going, that's also pure incompetence. You look at how the West is reacting to the challenge of global warming, also a case of pure incompetence. But the one that I fear the most, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is that the fear of proliferation of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. Indeed, one of the greatest achievements we've had in the last 40, 50 years is that we have managed to more or less hold the line on nuclear proliferation. And the reason why we were able to hold the line on nuclear proliferation is because there was a grand bargain between the 5 official nuclear weapon states, United States, Russia, China, UK and France, and the other states, that while the other states prevented themselves from going nuclear, the 5 nuclear weapon states would also reduce their nuclear arsenals and certainly not walk towards the nuclear threshold. And here, one fact that many Americans are not aware of is that one of the greatest violators of the NPT today is the United States. It has kept increasing, modernizing its nuclear arsenals. And if you have someone as influential as Donald Rumsfeld saying, "What's wrong with nuclear bunker busters?" then you're crossing the nuclear threshold you're not supposed to cross under the NPT. So clearly, something has gone wrong in the way America approaches these issues. And this is why I'm glad that this group of wise men, you know, Kissinger, Schultz, Perry, I think one more, have come out with a statement saying, please, let's find a way of putting the nuclear genie back in the bottle. It's America that has uncorked this nuclear genie, and it's up to America to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle, because it is in America's long-term national interest to prevent this kind of nuclear proliferation. And what Americans have got to understand is that the NPT is not a solitary treaty on its own. It's part of a complex fabric of multilateral organizations. The NPT is not self-enforcing. When the NPT needs to be enforced, you have to turn to the United Nations to enforce the NPT. But if America keeps attacking the United Nations, and if you keep sending an ambassador like John Bolton, who believes his job is not to strengthen the United Nations, but to weaken the United Nations, if you keep on weakening the United Nations, how can you then use it to maintain the NPT? That's an amazing fundamental contradiction in America's policies on multilateral issues, and most Americans are not aware of it. And if you want to, and at the same time, you want to preserve the sanctity of treaties like NPT, you must become, America as a state, a role model in also respecting other treaties. Why do you walk away from CTBT? Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Why do you walk away from it? You have nuclear weapons. Other states don't have nuclear weapons. The CTBT prevents them from carrying out nuclear tests. You should respect that treaty. It's in your long-term interest to do so. So in these areas, America is clearly shooting itself in the foot.
A critic might say of what you're saying that, well, let's compare the United States with China. In the case of China, for example, its generosity, it's toward ASEAN during the financial crisis, where it kept the yuan fixed, was supported by its domestic concerns, namely the continued need for the economic machine to work, to employ more and more people, and so on. On the other hand, the United States, which is showing less generosity, even a meanness in its international affairs, one could argue that the leaders are responding to domestic interest groups that are, in essence, being disenfranchised as the rest of the world is marching toward modernity. Not so much disenfranchised, but are suffering the economic consequences. How do we reconcile these two pictures? I mean, because obviously the leadership in China and the leadership in America have different set of problems, but the solution lies in somehow figuring how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on a very important point here, I mean, one reason why the rest of the world was happy to see the Western powers remain as custodians of the international order, custodians of the major international organizations, because the West had the strongest and most self-confident populations in the whole world. And, the reason why the United States could, for example, argue forcefully, and Europe could argue forcefully for trade liberalization, was because they believe that as a result of trade liberalization, as a result of countries opening up their economies, America and Europe would naturally do well. So let's open up and compete. What's happened in the last 10 years, and this is a major shift in world history, by the way, the populations in Europe and the populations in America, certainly if you listen to Lou Dobbs on CNN, are beginning to fear that if you push for trade liberalization, no longer Europe is going to win, no longer America is going to win, it may be the Chinese and the Indians and so on and so forth. And that's a real danger for the world, because if suddenly the custodians of the international trade order begin to lose faith that they can win in this game, then they begin to retreat. And the danger is that these international trade institutions and processes could be endangered. And this is really the fundamental reason why the Doha round is being threatened. And here, this is why you need a much more sophisticated intelligentsia in America to actually explain to the American population that this is what free market economics is all about. Indeed, it was a European economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who said, hey, if you want free market economics, you have to have creative destruction. So, for example, in the case of Singapore, we used to have a textile industry, but once China and India began to develop textile industry, we said, with our high wages, we cannot compete with China and India. So we moved out. So you have to keep on shifting and adjusting and move into the areas of economic competition that you can do well. And clearly, America and Europe can do very well. You still have the best educated populations, the largest capital resources, you have the best universities in the world. You have a tremendous competitive edge over the rest of the world. America and Europe can compete and can win. But none of the leaders in Europe or America have the courage to tell the populations, we can compete and win if we adjust our economies, if we give up policies that are self-destructive. And one of the most self-destructive policies that Europe has is a common agricultural policy. There's a statistic which shows that with all the monies that the Europeans spend to subsidize their cows, they can fly each cow around the world 5 times in business class and still pay for duty-free shopping. So, I mean, that's an amazing gross abuse of funds on the part of the Europeans. And that same money basically could be used to create a much more stable world by exporting its prosperity to all its neighbors.
Kishore, on that note and of warning and actually of hope, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. I want to recommend your book to our audience. It will be good for them to read, to see how we have to change if we elect a new president. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.